The wind whispered through the ancient trees as Orson walked along the familiar trail, his slow, rhythmic steps echoing softly in the quiet of the forest. At 72, his body no longer had the strength of yesteryear, but his deep blue eyes maintained the same attentive gleam they had always possessed. The golden late afternoon light filtered through the treetops, creating dancing patterns on the ground, covered with dry leaves that crackled beneath his worn shoes. To any distant observer, he was just a lonely old man on his daily walk. But for Orson, these walks were an almost sacred ritual, a moment of communion with nature and with memories that the solitude of his cabin couldn't fully embrace. At the bend in the path, his wrinkled fingers instinctively touched the small medallion around his neck, a dog tag worn by time. It had belonged to Max, his faithful companion for 15 years, now just a memory buried beneath the great oak tree in his cabin's backyard. The forest felt different that afternoon. There was an electricity in the air, an almost palpable tension that made Orson pause for a moment, his senses sharpened by decades of attunement to this place. That's when he heard it, a joyful, carefree sound that seemed out of place in that solemn atmosphere. Turning toward the sound, his eyes narrowed as he spotted a golden blur moving energetically near the edge of the cliff. A Labrador, with fur shining like honey under the sun, was chasing something invisible. Orson's heart raced. That area was dangerous. The ground was treacherous, especially after the previous week's rains. His body reacted before his mind fully processed the situation, propelling him forward with an urgency that his joints protested against. "Stop!" he shouted, his hoarse voice cutting through the air like a blade. But it was too late. The sound of the collapse was dull, almost imperceptible, a slight displacement of earth followed by the look of surprise on the animal's face, and then emptiness. The desperate bark that echoed up from the cliff below was like an arrow piercing Orson's chest. Time seemed to freeze as he ran, ignoring the pain in his knees, the heavy breathing burning in his lungs. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, awakening muscles long dormant with age. When he reached the edge, his eyes frantically scanned the slope. The Labrador was trapped on a small ledge, about 15 feet below, its paws desperately scratching at the unstable surface. Its eyes, brown and terrified, fixed on Orson with a silent plea that transcended any species barrier. "Hold on," muttered Orson, more to himself than to the dog. "I'm coming." The world around him fell silent. In that moment there was no past or future, only the present and the life hanging by a thread before his eyes. The moment of decision was brief, crystalline like the cold air that cut across his wrinkled face. Orson assessed the situation with the clarity of someone who intimately knows the limits of their own body. His mind calculated probabilities while his eyes scanned the terrain for a safe route. There was no one around. The trail he followed was rarely frequented, especially at this time of day. "Just you and me, buddy," he said softly to the dog, watching him with imploring eyes. His gnarled fingers grasped an exposed root that looked robust enough. He tested its strength with a firm pull. It would hold. It had to hold. With deliberate methodism, Orson removed his heavy coat, tying one sleeve around his wrist and the other to the root, an improvised anchor that could make the difference between life and death. The descent began slowly. Each movement was calculated, each foothold tested before bearing his full weight. Loose stones shifted beneath his feet, falling into the abyss below with a noise that amplified the gravity of the situation. Sweat trickled down his forehead despite the cold, momentarily blurring his vision. His breath formed small clouds in the air as he murmured words of encouragement to both the dog and himself. Almost there. Just a little more. A stone gave way under his right foot, causing his body to swing dangerously. For a terrible instant, Orson felt the void below him as a living presence calling to him. His muscles protested violently as he clung tightly to the rocky wall, fingernails breaking against the rough stone. The sharp pain in his fingers brought him back to the present moment, anchoring him in reality. The Labrador watched his approach with a mixture of hope and fear, its body visibly trembling. When Orson finally reached the same ledge, he was surprised to find that the dog showed no aggression, only relief. It was as if the animal perfectly understood the purpose of his presence. "Hello there, boy," Orson spoke softly, slowly extending a hand for the dog to sniff. "Let's get out of this place, what do you say?" The Labrador responded by cautiously approaching, its wet nose touching Orson's injured fingers. The cold touch sent a wave of determination through the old man's exhausted body. It wasn't just his life at stake now. It was the silent promise made to a being that completely trusted him. "I need you to trust me," he whispered, looking directly into the animal's eyes. "It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's our only chance." With slow movements, he positioned himself beside the dog and, using all his remaining strength, partially lifted it. The animal weighed more than he expected, and for a terrible moment, Orson doubted his ability to complete the rescue. The pain in his back was excruciating. His muscles trembled under the effort, and sweat now flowed freely down his face. On the horizon, the sun began its final descent, painting the sky with orange hues that reflected in the Labrador's golden fur. Night was approaching rapidly. If they couldn't climb up soon, darkness would make the task almost impossible. "Fine now or never," muttered Orson, gritting his teeth as he repositioned the dog in his arms. The animal, as if understanding the seriousness of the situation, remained remarkably quiet, its eyes fixed on Orson's with a trust that awakened something in the old man's chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The climb would be even more difficult than the descent. With his arms occupied holding the dog, Orson would have to rely mainly on the strength of his legs and the precarious support the rocky wall offered. The root serving as his safety line seemed thinner now, stretched under the additional tension. The sun touched the horizon when Orson finally made his decision. With a deep sigh, he began the climb back up, carrying not just the weight of a frightened Labrador, but also the weight of a silent promise. The promise that neither of them would face the night on that cliff. Every inch of the climb was a battle. Orson's muscles, long accustomed only to the gentle rhythm of his daily walks, screamed in protest. The Labrador remained surprisingly calm in his arms, as if it sensed that any sudden movement could be fatal for both of them. The only sound was Orson's labored breathing and the occasional low whimper from the dog when the grip became uncomfortable. "Almost there, boy. Just a little more," Orson murmured between broken breaths, words that served more to keep his own spirits up than to comfort the animal. Halfway up the climb, the root that served as his safety line emitted a worrying crack. Orson froze, his heart painfully accelerating against his ribs. If the root gave way now, there would be no hope for either of them. With deliberate gentleness, he redistributed his weight, seeking more secure footing. It was in this critical moment that the Labrador did something unexpected. It shifted slightly in his arms, positioning itself to relieve some of the tension on Orson's aching muscles. The old man blinked, surprised by the animal's apparent sensitivity to his situation. "You're smart, aren't you?" he whispered, a fragile smile forming on his exhausted face. "Been in tough spots before, I imagine." The dog's eyes, liquid amber reflecting the golden light of the sunset, met his. There was something in that look, a wisdom, an understanding that transcended words. For an instant, Orson felt a connection so deep that he almost lost his balance, not from the weight in his arms but from the force of the emotion that swept through him. The climb continued, each movement slower than the last. His fingers, now bloody from grasping the rough rocks, left red marks on the stones like a map of his determination. The pain was beyond anything he could describe, a constant presence that threatened to engulf him at any moment. "You know," Orson began, his voice broken by effort, "I had a friend like you, Max. He would have liked you." Talking helped maintain focus, pushing away the darkness that threatened to invade his peripheral vision. The Labrador tilted its head slightly, its ears moving to the sound of Orson's voice, as if it were really listening, really understanding. 15 years together," he continued, pausing to find new footing. "Thought when he was gone, it would be the end of me too. In a way it was." A cold wind blew across the cliff, making the dog's golden fur ripple like a field of wheat under moonlight. The first stars were beginning to appear in the rapidly darkening sky. Orson knew they needed to reach the top before complete darkness made the task impossible. With a final surge of adrenaline, he accelerated his movements, ignoring his muscles' protests. The edge of the cliff was now just a few yards away, so close that he could feel renewed hope flowing through his veins, giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. When he finally reached his free hand over the flat surface of the top, Orson allowed himself a moment of pure relief. With a final effort, he pushed the Labrador to safety, before dragging his own exhausted body away from the edge. Both collapsed onto the fresh grass, panting, their bodies trembling with residual adrenaline and effort. Orson closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the solid ground beneath his back, the open sky above, and, surprisingly, a warm tongue licking his injured hand. He opened his eyes to find the Labrador watching him intently, eyes bright with what could only be described as gratitude. A weak laugh escaped his dry lips. "You almost gave me a heart attack, you know that." In response, The dog moved closer, pressing its warm body against Orson's side, sharing heat and comfort without words. For a long moment, they remained like this, man and dog, united by the shared experience of survival. The moment of peace was interrupted by the distant sound of calling voices. Orson raised himself on his elbows, straining to hear better. The Labrador also became alert, its ears moving in the direction of the sound, but to Orson's surprise, the animal didn't run toward the voices. Instead, it remained firmly at his side, as if determined to protect him. "Bran, where are you?" The voices became clearer, and Orson realized they were searching for the dog. "Your name is Bran, then?" he murmured, running his hand through the animal's golden fur. "Strong name, suits you." The dog's eyes never left his, even when the sound of approaching footsteps became audible. There was something in that gaze, a depth that made Orson feel as if he were being truly seen for the first time in years. When the group of people finally appeared on the trail, their expressions quickly shifted from relief at seeing the dog to surprise at Orson's condition, his torn clothes, bloodied hands, and the evident exhaustion on his face. "My God, what happened here?" asked a middle-aged woman hurrying toward them. Orson just smiled tiredly, his hand still resting on Bran's fur. "Let's just say your friend here decided to explore some of the more exciting areas of the trail." "Bran! Oh, thank God!" exclaimed an athletic-looking man, approaching with hurried steps. His eyes oscillated between the dog and Orson, trying to comprehend the scene before him. "What happened? Are you all right, sir?" Orson tried to stand up, but his muscles protested violently, making him fall back to the ground with a muffled groan. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the rescue was now dissipating, leaving in its place a sharp, generalized pain that seemed to emanate from every cell in his body. "He fell," Orson answered, his voice weaker than he would have liked. "Over the cliff. I managed to climb down and bring him back up." The silence that followed his words was almost palpable. The three strangers, the athletic man, the middle-aged woman, and a teenager who remained a few steps behind, looked at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to admiration. "You climbed down the cliff?" asked the woman, her gaze shifting to the nearby edge. "Alone?" "To save Bran." There was something in her voice, a tremor of disbelief mixed with something deeper, something like reverence, that made Orson suddenly uncomfortable. He had never been good at handling gratitude or admiration. "Couldn't leave him down there," he replied simply, as if that were the only possible answer, as if anyone would have done the same. The Labrador, Bran, still hadn't moved from his side, even when the athletic man knelt and extended his hand to call him. The dog briefly looked at his owner, but remained firmly pressed against Orson, as if declaring silent loyalty. "He likes you," commented the man, a curious smile forming on his face. "And Bran is usually a good judge of character. We need to get you to a hospital," interrupted the woman, her eyes assessing Orson's injuries with professional concern. "I'm a nurse. You could have internal injuries, not to mention those hands." Orson shook his head, the idea of hospitals and doctors making his stomach turn uncomfortably. "I'm fine. Just need to rest a bit before heading back home." "No way," insisted the woman, her tone allowing no arguments. "At the very least, we're taking you to our cabin. It's only 10 minutes from here. We can take care of those cuts, offer you something to eat, and then if you're really okay, you can go home." There was a determination in her voice that reminded Orson of his late wife, Margaret, the same tone she used when she knew she was right and wouldn't accept discussion. The memory brought an involuntary smile to his lips. "All right," he finally agreed, allowing the man to help him up, but just for a few minutes. The path to the cabin was slow and painful. Each step sent waves of pain through his exhausted body, but Orson refused to show weakness. Bran walked by his side, occasionally pressing against his leg when the terrain became steeper, as if offering silent support. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by the dog's owners, who exchanged meaningful glances among themselves. The cabin, when they finally arrived, was larger and more luxurious than Orson had expected, more of a modern vacation home than the rustic structure he had imagined. Large windows offered panoramic views of the forest, and the interior was spacious and welcoming, with furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive. Please sit down," offered the woman, indicating a comfortable-looking sofa. "I'll get the first aid kit." As she walked away, the man extended his hand. "My name's Thomas. This is my wife, Eleanor, and our son, Daniel. And well, you've already met Bran." Orson accepted the handshake, feeling the controlled strength in the gesture. Orson Miller. "You saved his life," said Thomas, sitting in the opposite armchair. "I don't know how to thank you properly." Before Orson could respond, Eleanor returned with a substantial medical kit. With professional efficiency, she began cleaning and treating the cuts on his hands, applying antiseptic that stung intensely, followed by clean bandages. "Do you have someone waiting for you at home, Mr. Miller?" asked Elena as she worked, her movements gentle but precise. The question, though casually made, hit Orson like a physical blow. "No," he answered after a pause. "Not for a long time." Something in his tone must have communicated more than his words, for Elena just nodded without pressing. Bran, who had settled at Orson's feet, raised his head and emitted a small whimper, as if responding to the unspoken sadness. "You know," began Thomas, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, "we're just visitors here. We've had this cabin for a few years, but we only manage to come a few weeks a year. The rest of the time it sits empty." Orson didn't understand where the conversation was going, but he nodded politely. "What Thomas is trying to say," intervened Eleanor, finishing the bandage on Orson's right hand, "is that Bran loves this place. The forest, the trails, but our time here is ending. We need to go back to the city in 2 days. Bran will be devastated," continued Thomas. "He hates our apartment in the city. Too confined, too noisy." There was a significant pause, during which the couple exchanged a look laden with silent communication. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath and continued. "Mr. Miller, I know this may seem sudden, but would you consider keeping Bran?" The room suddenly seemed to fill with dense silence, heavy with the weight of the unexpected proposal. Orson looked at Thomas, then at Elena, certain he had misunderstood. "Keep? You want me to adopt your dog?" The incredulity in his voice was evident. "It's not a decision we take lightly," Eleanor quickly assured him. "But you've seen how he is with you, and after what you did today, it almost seems like it was meant to be." Orson looked at the Labrador at his feet. Bran returned his gaze with those amber eyes that seemed to see right through him. For a fleeting moment, Max's face superimposed itself on the golden Labrador's, the memory of his old companion so vivid it almost hurt. "I can't," Orson began, his voice failing. The idea of opening himself up again to the kind of love and inevitably loss that came with a companion like Bran was almost terrifying. "I don't know if—" "Think about it," Thomas gently offered. "We don't need an answer right now, but Bran clearly chose you today. And in my experience, dogs have an unerring instinct for these things." As Orson processed all this, feeling almost dizzy with how quickly his peaceful day had transformed into something so unexpected, the sky outside completely darkened. Raindrops began to drum against the large windows, first hesitantly, then with increasing intensity. "You shouldn't drive in this weather, especially after what you've been through today," Eleanor firmly declared. "We have a guest room ready. Please, stay tonight." Orson wanted to protest, wanted to return to the familiar safety of his lonely cabin, to the comfort of his unchanged routine. But his aching body, the torrential rain, and most surprisingly, the hopeful look in Bran's eyes conspired against his resistance. "Just tonight," he finally agreed, feeling as if he were on the edge of another kind of cliff, not physical this time, but equally frightening in its uncertainty. As the night progressed and the storm raged outside, Orson found himself sitting by the crackling fireplace, with Bran sleeping peacefully at his side. In the hypnotic dance of the flames, he saw reflections of a past he thought was closed, and perhaps glimpses of a future he had never considered possible. Morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that only follows a violent storm. Orson woke up in the guest room, momentarily confused about where he was, until the events of the previous day returned in a wave of memory. His body protested when he tried to sit up, every muscle reminding him of the extraordinary effort he had made. A gentle movement beside the bed caught his attention. Bran was there, sitting patiently, his amber eyes fixed on Orson with an intensity that almost seemed human. "Did you stay here all night?" asked Orson, his voice hoarse from sleep. In response, Bran moved closer, gently resting his muzzle on the mattress. The gesture was so full of trust, so devoid of any hesitation, that something inside Orson's chest seemed to loosen, a tense knot he didn't even know he carried. Slowly, he extended his hand and touched the dog's head, feeling the soft fur under his bandaged fingers. The gesture awakened memories of Max lying in that same way, of lazy mornings when the silent presence of his old friend was all the companionship he needed in the world. "You're persistent, aren't you?" he murmured, a reluctant smile forming on his wrinkled face. After dressing in clothes borrowed from Thomas, slightly large but clean and dry, Orson found the family in the spacious kitchen. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pancakes in the air created an atmosphere of domesticity that was simultaneously inviting and painfully nostalgic. "Good morning," greeted Elena, handing him a steaming mug. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell off a cliff," Orson replied dryly, accepting the coffee with gratitude. "But I'll survive." Breakfast proceeded in surprisingly easy conversation. Daniel, the teenager who had been so silent the day before, revealed himself to be curious and articulate, asking questions about Orson's life in the forest, about his daily walks, and what it was like to live so isolated. Orson found himself answering in more detail than he normally would, sharing stories of his life that he hadn't revisited in years. There was something liberating about speaking with strangers who had no expectations, who didn't know him as Old Miller or Margaret's widower. Through his fragmented narrative, a portrait emerged of a man who had loved deeply, lost immensely, and gradually withdrawn from the world into a cocoon of routine and isolation. He spoke of Margaret, of their 42 years together, of the cancer that took her so quickly that he barely had time to process what was happening. He spoke of Max, the dog that had been his lifeline in the following years, and how his death 3 years ago had been like losing his last link to a life that made sense. As he spoke, Bran remained by his side, occasionally resting his head on Orson's knee as if offering silent comfort. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. "Have you considered what we talked about last night?" Thomas eventually asked, his voice carefully neutral. Orson looked at Bran, then at the family watching with barely disguised hopeful expressions. He knew what they saw: a lonely old man without family, a man whose life had been reduced to empty routines and memories. They probably thought they were offering both him and Bran a second chance, and perhaps they were. Orson began, then stopped, uncertain how to articulate the contradictory emotions swirling inside him. Elena leaned forward, her eyes gentle. "It's not an easy decision, we know that, and if it doesn't work out, we can always find another solution. But Bran clearly feels a connection with you, and you risked your life for him, without even knowing him." Orson thought about his silent cabin, about the days stretching before him without variation, about the nights when the silence became almost deafening. He thought about the empty chair by the fireplace where Max used to sleep, about the empty space he had never managed to fill. "I have my habits," he finally said, "and I'm not young. Bran is energetic. He'll need more than I can offer. He needs love," Thomas replied simply. "The rest is negotiable." At that moment, as if understanding they were talking about him, Bran stood up and rested his front paws on Orson's lap, his face inches from the old man's. His eyes, so expressive it almost hurt to look at them, seemed to ask a silent question, and Orson, to his own surprise, discovered he already knew the answer. "All right," he said softly, more to Bran than to the humans at the table. "We can try." The relief on the family's faces was palpable. Daniel, in particular, looked simultaneously happy and a little sad, a reminder that, for them, this was also a farewell. The next hours passed in a blur of preparations. Thomas and Daniel drove to Orson's cabin to collect essentials he would need for the first few days with Bran, his own clothes, personal items, and to check that everything was secure for his absence. They returned with stories of a clean, organized home that spoke volumes about the man who lived there, a place of order and routine but also of solitude. Elena spent the time explaining Bran's habits, his favorite foods, his medical history, and all the little details that make up a dog's life. Orson listened attentively, making mental notes, occasionally glancing at Bran, who hadn't left his side all morning. "He doesn't like thunderstorms," Elena explained, her voice tinged with the tenderness of someone speaking about a beloved child. "He'll want to hide under your bed or in a closet. Just let him be, he works it out on his own." Orson nodded, remembering how Max had been the same way, terrified of thunder, seeking dark corners during storms. The similarity made his heart tighten with a mixture of pain and warmth. When the time came for final goodbyes, there were tears, mostly from Daniel, who knelt to hug Bran fiercely, whispering something in the dog's ear that made his tail wag softly. Elena's eyes were shining with unshed tears, and even Thomas's voice was rougher than usual as he handed Orson a folder containing all of Bran's documents and information. "Take care of each other," Thomas said simply, extending his hand for a final handshake. Orson felt a lump in his throat as he accepted the gesture. "We will." As he drove home with Bran sitting calmly in the passenger seat of his old truck, Orson felt a strange mixture of trepidation and anticipation. The road ahead was familiar but somehow different now. No longer just a path back to solitude, but a journey towards something new. "Just you and me now, buddy," he said softly, briefly taking one hand off the wheel to pat Bran's head. The Labrador looked at him with those thoughtful amber eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of the ages, then turned to look out the window at the passing landscape, as if already accepting his new life. 3 months later, as the first autumn leaves began to fall, Orson stood at the edge of his property, watching Bran chase a squirrel across the yard with all the enthusiasm of a puppy despite his 5 years of age. The scene brought a smile to his face, a now common expression that had once been rare. Life with Bran had settled into a new routine, different from the solitary existence Orson had known, but comforting in its own way. The empty spaces in his cabin, physical and emotional, had gradually filled with the presence of the Labrador. Dog toys scattered across the living room floor, a plush bed, rarely used since Bran preferred sleeping next to Orson's bed, and the constantly full water bowl in the kitchen were tangible evidence of the change. But the most significant transformations weren't visible. They existed in the way Orson now paused during his walks to allow Bran to investigate interesting scents, in how he found himself talking aloud about his day to attentive ears, in the way he started cooking proper meals again because, if I'm making food for you, I might as well eat decently too. The weekly phone calls with Elena had evolved from her checking on Bran's adjustment to genuine conversations about life, weather, and the small joys of everyday existence. She never explicitly said it, but Orson could tell she was checking on him as much as on the dog, and he found he didn't mind. That particular morning had started like any other. Breakfast, a short walk, some reading by the window, while Bran napped at his feet. But something had shifted when Orson reached for his coat for their afternoon walk. Instead of heading for their usual trail, his feet had turned toward a path he hadn't taken in over 3 years, the one leading to the old oak tree where Max rested. Bran had followed without hesitation, seemingly understanding the solemnity of the moment. When they reached the simple marker, a smooth stone with Max crudely etched into it, Orson stood in silence, his hand instinctively finding the dog tag around his neck. This was Max, he had explained unnecessarily to Bran, who sat quietly beside him, golden fur ruffling in the gentle breeze. He was my friend for a long time. The Labrador had looked at the stone, then at Orson, before gently pressing his body against the old man's legs in a gesture of silent understanding. Something about that moment had released a knot deep inside Orson's chest, a tightness he had carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Now, watching Bran's joyful exploration of the yard, Orson reflected on how life had a way of coming full circle. He had saved Bran from the cliff, but in many ways, Bran had saved him from a different kind of fall, a slow descent into isolation and irrelevance. "Bran," he called, his voice stronger now than it had been in years. "Time for our walk." At the sound of the word walk, the Labrador immediately abandoned his squirrel chase and bounded toward Orson, tail wagging excitedly. As they set off together down the familiar forest trail, Orson noticed how the path seemed more vibrant now, the colors more brilliant, the sounds more distinct, the scents more nuanced. Or perhaps it was simply that he was noticing them again, seeing the world through the enthusiastic perspective of his companion. They had walked about a mile when the sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally released a light drizzle. Orson was about to suggest they turn back when his foot caught on an exposed root hidden by fallen leaves. The slip happened so quickly he didn't have time to react. One moment he was upright, the next he was tumbling down a muddy embankment, pain shooting through his ankle as he came to rest against a fallen log. "Damn it," he muttered, assessing the damage. The ankle was already swelling, and when he tried to stand, a sharp pain confirmed what he suspected. He wouldn't be walking out of here on his own. Bran stood at the top of the embankment, barking anxiously, clearly distressed by Orson's predicament. The old man tried to call him down, but the slope was too steep and slippery. "Stay there, boy," he called instead. "Good dog. Stay safe." For a moment it seemed like Bran might try to descend anyway, his body tense with indecision. Then, with one last sharp bark that almost sounded like a promise, he turned and disappeared into the forest. "Bran!" Orson called after him, a surge of panic rising in his chest. But the dog was gone, leaving only silence and the soft patter of rain. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as Orson sat in the increasing downpour, his thoughts oscillating between concern for Bran and his own predicament. Had the dog simply run off, frightened by the accident? Would he find his way home alone? Or was he lost in the vastness of the forest? The rain intensified, soaking through Orson's jacket and chilling him to the bone. His ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, and the realization of his vulnerability struck him with sudden clarity. He was an old man, injured and alone in the woods during a storm, miles from the nearest neighbor. The situation was more than uncomfortable. It was potentially life-threatening. Just as despair began to creep in, the sound of distant barking cut through the drumming of rain. Orson raised his head, straining to hear better. Yes, there it was again. Bran's distinctive bark, accompanied now by voices. "Mr. Miller!" A distant call confirmed his hopes. "Orson Miller! Here!" he shouted back, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sire, down here." Minutes later, the embankment above him was crowded with figures. Ted Johnson and his son from the property neighboring his, both dressed in raincoats and boots, and Bran, soaking wet but tail-wagging furiously as he spotted Orson. "That's quite a dog you've got there, Orson," called Ted as he carefully made his way down the slope. "I showed up at our door barking like crazy, then kept running back to the trail. Figured something must be wrong." Relief washed over Orson as powerful as the rain. Bran hadn't abandoned him. He'd gone for help, deliberately seeking out the nearest humans who could assist. The realization was overwhelming. With Ted and his son's help, Orson was carefully extracted from the embankment and supported back to their truck. Throughout the rescue, Bran stayed close, occasionally licking Orson's hand, as if to reassure him that everything would be all right. At the local medical center, as a doctor wrapped his sprained ankle and prescribed rest, Bran was allowed to stay by his side. An exception made after Ted explained the circumstances of the rescue. "You've got yourself a regular lassie there," the doctor commented with a smile. "Not many dogs would have the sense to go find help like that." Orson nodded, his hand resting on Bran's damp fur. "He's special." Later that evening, safely back home with his ankle elevated and a fire crackling in the hearth, Orson reflected on the day's events. Bran lay next to his chair, unwilling to be more than a few feet away, his eyes occasionally opening to check on his human before drifting back to sleep. "You saved me today," Orson said softly, his fingers gently stroking the Labrador's ear. "Just like I saved you on that cliff. Seems we're even now." Bran shifted, resting his head on Orson's knee, his amber eyes looking up with that penetrating gaze that seemed to understand everything. The weight of his head was comforting, anchoring Orson to the present moment. In the dancing firelight, Orson's thoughts drifted to the strange sequence of events that had brought them together. If he hadn't been walking that particular trail at that exact moment, if Bran hadn't slipped on that cliff, if the family hadn't offered their dog to a complete stranger, any break in that chain would have led to a completely different present. "Life's funny that way," he murmured, more to himself than to Bran. "So all those years I thought I was just waiting for the end, and turns out I was waiting for a beginning." The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was Eleanor, calling for their weekly check-in. When Orson told her about the day's adventure, her gasp was audible even through the phone. "Oh my God, Orson. Are you sure you're all right?" The genuine concern in her voice warmed him as much as the fire. "I'm fine, better than fine, actually." He looked down at Bran, who had fallen asleep with his head still resting on Orson's knee. "I think I finally understand something." "What's that?" Eleanor asked softly. "Why you gave him to me." Orson's voice wavered slightly. "It wasn't just about giving Bran a better home. It was about giving me a reason." The silence on the other end of the line was filled with understanding. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "I think you're both exactly where you need to be." After they hung up, Orson sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the rain pattering against the windows and Bran's soft, rhythmic breathing. On the mantelpiece, Max's dog tag caught the firelight gleaming softly. Next to it now sat a framed photo that Thomas had sent last week, a picture of Bran as a puppy, all paws and ears too big for his body, eyes already full of the intelligence that defined him. Past and present, side by side, spring came to the forest with an explosion of new life. The trails that Orson and Bran walked daily transformed from barren paths to corridors of vibrant green, wildflowers dotting the undergrowth like scattered jewels. Bran would often return from his explorations with muddy paws and a doggy grin that seemed to say, "Isn't the world amazing today?" And Orson, despite his 72 years and the occasional ache in his joints, found himself agreeing. The world was amazing, seen through fresh eyes. The changes weren't limited to their forest walks. Slowly, Orson's life had expanded beyond the boundaries of his solitary routine. Ted Johnson and his family now regularly invited him for Sunday dinners. He'd begun volunteering at the local library 2 afternoons a week, with Bran lying quietly at his feet as he read to children who were more interested in petting the friendly Labrador than in the stories themselves. And then there were the letters and occasional visits from Thomas, Elena, and Daniel. What had begun as updates about Bran had evolved into a genuine friendship. Daniel, especially, had attached himself to Orson, peppering him with questions about the forest, about carpentry, about life in the old days. The boy's curiosity was boundless, and Orson found himself enjoying the role of elder sage, sharing knowledge he hadn't realized he possessed. One evening, as Orson sat on his porch with Bran at his side, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he reflected on how thoroughly his life had changed in a single year. The silence that had once been his only companion was now filled with purpose, with barks and laughter, with phone calls and visitors, with the simple joy of being needed. Bran shifted beside him, resting his chin on Orson's knee with a contented sigh. "We did good, didn't we?" Orson murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears just the way he liked. The Labrador's eyes met his, warm and wise and somehow knowing. In that silent exchange was everything that needed to be said, a recognition of the journey they had taken together, from a perilous cliff edge to this peaceful porch, from strangers to inseparable companions. Some might call it chance, that Bran had been in that precise spot at that precise moment, that Orson had been there to witness his fall. But sitting there with the weight of the dog's head on his knee and the warmth of connection in his heart, Orson preferred to call it something else, a second chance, for both of them. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.